I am Mark Caldwell, and my wonderful wife Judy and I have been married for 5 years, and she is already 2 months pregnant. This is a very important moment for us, since we have been trying to have a baby for 2 years, but we still couldn't do it. Until one day, Judy made me happy with this wonderful news. I am sorry that I was in the dark for so long and did not notice the banal things. One of my working days, 2 policemen came to my office and reported the terrible situation of my wife. Perhaps from this moment I will begin my story.
I was sitting in my corner office, the windows of which overlooked endless rows of gray buildings. The rays of the setting sun pierced through the glass, playing on the keys of my computer. A plan for the evening had already formed in my mind. Today, I decided to surprise my beloved wife, Judy. She deserved it, especially considering how the last few months of her pregnancy had been challenging for us both. We were eagerly awaiting our baby, planning each day as if he was already with us. My reflections were interrupted by a colleague's voice penetrating through the half-open door. "You've got visitors, guys in uniform?" he shouted, his voice tinged with a hint of curiosity. My hand involuntarily froze above the keyboard. The police? Here? For me? Rising from my desk, I headed towards the door and saw 2 policemen. They stood, calmly waiting for me to approach. One of them, who seemed older and more experienced, had a soft yet penetrating gaze. "Sir, we need to talk to you. Can you spare us a few minutes?" His tone was polite, but I sensed a note of seriousness. "Of course. Come in," I replied, making way for them into my office. Having seated them and taken a seat opposite, I awaited further words. "We've come to you with unfortunate news. Your wife, Judy, has been hospitalized. She is in a critical condition," the elder one started without preamble. The world around me froze. "What? How could this happen? She was at home on maternity leave." My words burst out involuntarily. I couldn't understand how my wife, whom I had left in the morning happy and healthy, suddenly ended up in the hospital. "Don't worry, she was taken to the hospital by a man named Mr Campos. Do you know him?" The policeman continued. The name meant nothing to me. Who was he? And what was he doing with my wife? "No, I don't know him." My response was brief. My thoughts were jumbled, and I tried to gather them together to understand what was happening. Could he be a brother or a distant relative? "We just need to understand whether this was an accident or intentional harm," one of them said. "How could I ever harm my wife, especially considering we are expecting a child? I swear," I responded, and the policeman offered to take me to the hospital to find out the examination results. I agreed without hesitation. Rising from my desk, I took my belongings. One question spun in my head: what is even happening? As soon as we arrived, I literally burst out of the car and ran to the main entrance, barely listening to the police officer's instructions to follow them. Inside the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and medicine immediately hit my nose, causing me to hold my breath for a moment. We approached the reception, where the police officers introduced themselves and requested information about Judy's condition. The woman behind the counter, with visible sympathy in her eyes, picked up the phone to contact the department. The minutes of waiting stretched endlessly. Finally, one of the officers placed a hand on my shoulder, as if trying to offer support. "Your wife is in critical but stable condition. We can talk to the doctor for more details regarding Mr. Campos. He happened to be nearby at the right moment and was able to get your wife here. So far, we see nothing criminal in his actions," the senior officer said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "How did this happen? Why was he nearby?" My voice trembled as I asked these questions, unable to hide my agitation. "For now, we are gathering information. Your wife is not in a condition to give a statement, and we hope you can help us understand everything once she recovers," the officer replied, his eyes full of sympathy. At that moment, a middle-aged doctor in a white coat approached me, his face calm but his eyes showing fatigue. "Are you Mrs. Judy's husband? My name is Dr. Simmons. Let's go to a room for a discussion. I'll tell you everything we know." We walked into a small room with a couple of chairs and a table. Sitting opposite the doctor, I noticed his look, full of professional compassion. "Your wife was brought here with severe bleeding. We did everything possible to stabilize her condition. Unfortunately, she lost the baby. She is currently under observation in the intensive care unit. We tried our best," he said. "But how? Why did this happen?" I asked. "We assume it's because of stress," he said. Stress? I thought to myself, not believing this nonsense. I completely didn't understand what was happening. "Can I see her?" I asked, barely holding back my emotions. My eyes must have been full of despair, because Dr. Simmons looked at me with even greater sympathy. "Unfortunately, it's not possible right now. Her condition is stable, but we want to minimize any stress. You'll be able to see her as soon as she recovers a bit." His words were gentle, but firm. I nodded, unable to utter a word. Emotions raged inside me, from grief and despair to anger at myself for not being there when it happened. It was hard for me to accept the thought that my future child had gone, without ever coming into this world. I absolutely couldn't believe that this had happened to me. Returning home that evening enveloped me in gloomy silence. I decided to clean, trying to distract myself from oppressive thoughts. Approaching the trash can to take out the accumulated garbage of the day, I noticed something sticking out. It was something insignificant, but my intuition told me to pay attention. It was a packet of pills. I didn't know what the pills were for, so I decided to look it up on the internet. It turned out that these were pills for terminating a pregnancy with medication. My heart instantly froze. How? Why? We wanted this child so much. A tangle of doubts and suspicions began to form in my mind. Thoughts became disjointed and chaotic. I turned all the garbage over, hoping it was some misunderstanding, a mistake. But the evidence was there. Judy had taken pills to terminate the pregnancy, despite our common desire to have a child. The decision came spontaneously. I needed someone who could help me sort out this chaos. That same evening, I hired a private detective, explaining the situation to him and showing him the found clue. His reaction was restrained, but in his eyes, I saw a spark of interest. "All right, I'll take care of it. But I'll need some time," he said, taking the package of pills. "And I'll need to know everything you know about Mr. Campos." I shared with him all the information and went home. 2 days later, the detective contacted me and told me more details about Mr. Campos, who turned out to be a colleague of my wife's. My wife was a teacher, and so was Mr. Campos. I immediately remembered all the times my wife stayed late at work or had unexpected meetings with colleagues outside of work hours. "Thank you, Mr. Bird, you've been a great help." I thanked the private detective and said that I would definitely call him if anything came up. The next day, Judy was finally supposed to be discharged from the hospital. Mixed feelings wrestled within me at the thought of meeting her. On one hand, I felt relieved that she was all right and could come home. On the other, I realized that she most likely had an affair with her colleague. Approaching the hospital, I noticed how nervousness grew with every meter. "Hello?" she barely whispered when I approached and hugged her. It was extremely awkward. On the way home, we hardly spoke. Judy seemed lost in her thoughts, and I didn't know how to start a conversation about what had been tormenting me all these days. After we got back, I helped her settle on the couch, made sure she was comfortably covered, and had everything she needed at hand. Only after that did I dare to start a conversation. "Judy, is there something you want to tell me?" I began, not knowing how best to continue. She looked at me in surprise. "I'm not in the mood. Is there a big problem?" "I'm very sorry that this happened. The doctor explained it was all due to stress." "But what stress? You didn't seem nervous, and overall you were in a good mood a couple of days before this incident. And I would like to know more about Christopher Campos." At the mention of that name, her face changed. "Chris is our new neighbor. He just happened to be nearby when I felt ill. Please don't think badly of me." Her voice sounded pleading. "I understand. Just, after everything that has happened, I feel so helpless. I want to understand, Judy. I want to help, I said, trying not to lose my composure, realizing that she was lying to me about Chris. The only help you can provide is if you keep quiet. She covered my mouth, and I fell silent. I understood that she had likely undergone a difficult surgery, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was to blame for everything. I decided not to tell her about my discovery in the trash bin, opting instead to wait until she fell asleep. A couple of hours later, when Judy finally fell asleep, I started to check her personal belongings in her bag, which she took to the hospital. I found nothing suspicious, except for a small pocket that closed with a thin lock. I pulled at it and discovered a deep pocket at the bottom of the bag, from which I took Judy's medical document that I had never seen before. It contained the results of a DNA test that Judy had secretly taken a couple of weeks ago, a fact I deduced from the date. With a trembling heart, I opened the envelope and began to read. What I saw on those pages turned my world upside down. The child was not mine. I realized that not only had my wife been unfaithful and gotten pregnant by another man, but she had also destroyed lives. It was a nightmare. Unsure of what to do, I first headed to Judy's former workplace the next day to meet with her boyfriend. I told Judy I was going to work, but would be home late. Upon arrival, Mr. Campos's colleagues informed me he was on break, likely having lunch at a cafe across the street. Without hesitation, I crossed the road and spotted Mr. Campos at the end of the hall, sitting with a young student, engaging in a pleasant conversation, laughing and exchanging glances. I approached their table. "Miss, good afternoon. May I have a moment to speak with Mr. Campos privately? We have a very urgent matter to discuss." Mr. Campos had no chance to object as the friendly student gave up her seat, and I found myself sitting across from my wife's lover. "Mark, what a coincidence. So glad to see you. It's just unfortunate that I have to leave now. Otherwise, I'd be happy to chat," he said, preparing to stand up, but with a swift motion, I grabbed his hand. "Hold on. We've just started, Mr. Campos. I have just a few questions for you." Mr. Campos realized my seriousness and sat down quietly, not attempting to resist. I placed the DNA test documents right in front of him, ensuring he couldn't lie to me. "Maybe you can explain what this is?" "Well, those are medical documents," he replied. "I'm not stupid. Don't waste my time and yours," I said. Mr. Campos had always been an inconspicuous man. I had seen him many times before, but would have never thought such a person would dare to sleep with another man's wife. He was cowardly and somewhat naive. I was surprised that my wife had such poor taste in lovers. It only took a few minutes for Mr. Campos to lay all his cards on the table and tell me everything that had happened with my wife. As it turned out, it all started more than 8 months ago. Mr. Campos claimed that Judy was the first to show signs of interest in him, and after that, they began to communicate via social media, eventually meeting daily for pleasant conversations. Within a month of such meetings, their relationship became sexual, and they shared a passion. Mr. Campos knew she was a married woman, but somehow fell for her. "Please just don't kill me," he said, continuing to tell me about what they had done with my wife. He said they had sex in the library, in the bathroom, at his home, while his parents were in the next room, in our house, and so on. He also showed me explicit photos that my wife had sent him. "You see, I didn't want it to turn out this way. I thought we'd have sex once, and then forget each other. But things went too far. You probably won't believe me, but she blackmailed me, saying if I didn't come to her, she would tell you everything," he said. "Okay. What were you doing in my house last week?" I asked. "I came to your house because the DNA test results came in, and Judy was very upset that the child wasn't yours, sir," he said. "Upset?" I asked. "Yes, she was very upset, so she took a whole pack of pills," he said. "Strange. Then why did the doctor tell me it was because of stress?" I thought to myself, realizing the doctor had withheld information from me. His days were numbered. But first, I had to deal with Mr. Campos. "So, what happened in the end? Did you break up with her?" I asked him. "Yes, but she keeps writing to me, he said, showing me his phone with at least 23 messages from Judy and 5 missed calls. Opening the chat, I realized Judy had invited him over to the house, wanting to apologize for her breakdown that day and her hospitalization. I read a small part of their conversation and realized that Mr. Campos was not lying to me, and Judy was indeed the initiator of all their meetings. I was horrified at the thought of living under the same roof with someone for 5 years and not knowing them at all. I trusted her so much that I couldn't even imagine such a thing. While I was reading the messages on Mr. Campos's phone, Judy unexpectedly called his phone. Mr. Campos asked me not to answer it, but I told him to pick it up and agree to meet her. Mr. Campos looked at me in surprise, but ultimately did as I said. He answered the call and put it on speakerphone. "Hi, Chris. Why are you ignoring me? I can stop being a nice kitty and become a fierce tigress," she said. "Hi, Judy. I was just busy with work," he replied nervously. "I don't care. My husband is at work today, and I'm prescribed a relaxing massage, but I have no one to do it. You know what I mean?" she said, and I sat there in complete shock. It was a real shock for me. "Yes, I'll be there in an hour," he said, and they ended the conversation. Mr. Campos looked at me with pleading eyes, as if asking for forgiveness. "Relax. We'll punish her, and she'll leave you alone," I reassured him. On the way to my house, Mr. Campos shared a funny story with me. He told me that Judy wouldn't let him meet other girls and was always jealous of him, which was another shock for me. When we arrived at my house, I told Mr. Campos that I would enter the house exactly in 15 minutes. My goal was to burst into the house and capture on my mobile phone's camera how my wife would be giving in to passion with another man. While Mr. Campos went to my house, I decided to call a divorce lawyer and described my situation to him. He informed me that he would prepare all the documents and I could come and pick them up tomorrow. He also mentioned it would be better if my wife voluntarily signed these documents. I said I would try to achieve this. Time passed. I turned on the camera and went into the house. I approached the front door and opened it abruptly and caught my wife sitting on Mr. Campos in the living room and kissing him. She only managed to quickly get off her lover and exclaim, "What the hell are you doing here?" The tension was palpable in the room when I sat across from Judy and Mr. Campos at the opposite end of the couch. Her gaze was filled with anxiety, and my heart pounded as if it wanted to burst out. "Judy, I know everything," I began, trying to keep my voice calm, but it trembled with accumulated emotions. She looked at me with her malicious gaze. "And that's all you have to say, after everything you've seen and captured on camera? Don't you see that this man barged into our home and started harassing me? You should beat him up?" She began to spout utter nonsense, and I realized she was slightly out of her mind. It was unpleasant to listen to her, but she was unaware that, following my lawyer's advice, I had also turned on the audio recording. "I found these birth control pills after you were hospitalized, and the results of the DNA test." I slowly pulled an envelope from my sweater pocket, proving that the child was not mine. Her eyes widened in surprise and fear, looking at the envelope in my hands. "How can you explain this, Judy?" My voice sounded harsher than I expected. Mr. Campos sat next to us and was in shock. It was hard not to notice that he was shaking. She was silent for a few moments, as if trying to find the words. "What kind of forgery is this, Mark?" she began, her voice quivering. "Are you trying to frame me? Don't you believe that the child was yours?" I couldn't recognize my sweet, kind, and sincere wife, Judy, who once meant everything to me, now drifting further and further away. "What about the DNA test, Judy? How do you explain that? Or do you want to say that the doctor's seal and signature are fake?" The words burst out of me, and each one felt like a stab. Judy's mood quickly changed. She froze, and tears began to roll down her cheeks. "I didn't want you to find out like this. I thought I could fix it, that we could be happy and have another child. Chris started harassing me, and I got pregnant from him. He wouldn't leave me alone. He was blackmailing me, and if you didn't understand, That asshole is sitting right in front of you." "What the hell?" Mr. Campos exclaimed. "Shut up. If it weren't for you, everything would have been fine." Judy lunged at Chris, starting to scratch him with her nails. I quickly pulled her aside, trying to protect both of us. "Stop lying. I know it was you who started harassing Chris and blackmailing him," I replied sternly. Judy stood in the middle of the room in just a robe, crying loudly, behaving extremely unnaturally, and it was evident she was not in her right mind. "Should we call the police?" Chris suggested. I attempted to approach Judy to calm her down, but she quickly broke free and ran to the kitchen, where she grabbed a knife and began threatening us. "If you believe that lying piece of crap, then I'm going to hurt myself." She started to manipulate. "Judy, what happened to you?" I began to carefully approach her, while Chris was calling the police and ambulance. "Darling, put the knife down and we'll figure everything out," I said, trying to calm her down. "Don't come any closer to me." She screamed at the top of her lungs, holding the knife in her hands and threatening to harm herself. I realized the situation was out of control and something had to be done. "I loved you, and you treat me so lowly, thinking that I cheated on you. I would never do that because I love you," she said. "I believe you. Don't worry. I realized I was wrong," I said, getting closer, deep down hoping she wouldn't harm herself. But I had big doubts about it. "Mark, I would never harm your child. Our child. But this child wasn't ours. It was that scumbag's who constantly harassed me at work. You know me. I would never do anything against you," she said. And it was incredibly painful for me to hear all this. "Let's just sit down and talk, like normal adults." I said this and saw red liquid appear on the knife's edge. Judy had apparently pressed the knife too hard against her skin. "We have nothing to talk about," she said, raising the knife above herself, and was about to strike, when suddenly Mr. Campos, who had been sneaking up on Judy from behind, jumped out at the right moment and knocked the knife out of Judy's hands. We tied Judy in bedsheets, and 30 minutes later, the ambulance and police arrived, to whom we explained everything that had happened. I decided to postpone the divorce proceedings because a couple of days later, the doctor told me some unpleasant news. "Mark, your wife needs treatment in a psychiatric hospital. The fact that she terminated the pregnancy and the stress from you finding out about her secret affair exacerbated her mental illnesses, which require immediate adjustment. Unfortunately, we do not know how much time may be needed for rehabilitation," said the doctor, and Judy was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. I immediately informed her parents about this. As well as that, I wanted to divorce her. A couple of weeks later, I filed for divorce from Judy, accusing her of marital infidelity, providing evidence in the form of photos, videos, and dialogue from correspondence with Mr. Campos. I also provided the DNA test results, which I found in her bag. Also, one of the reasons I stated was that Judy was placed in a psychiatric hospital. In the end, we got divorced, our property was split, and part of the money from the sale of the house I sent to Judy's parents, to whom I also sent photographs and the DNA test, as they were initially against me. I hope I never see that lunatic again. Can you imagine? 5 years of marriage, and in the end, I faced such a horror. Just think if she had done something to herself that day, I would have been quickly jailed, I said. And don't even say, you really need to be more careful when choosing future wives, and even more so, mistresses. Mr. Campos received a slap on the back of his head for that witty joke. A year after this tragic story, we became close friends, often meeting at the bar. Judy remained in the psychiatric hospital, and I began to build new relationships, hoping that this time everything would work out for me.
That's the end of the story. Write your opinion in the comments about this story. It will be interesting for us to read it. Also, do not forget to like and subscribe to our channel so as not to miss new, equally interesting and exciting stories. Good luck!